He walked out of that country club thinking he had closed a 24-year file. He did not know the file had already been opened by somebody else. 2 years before that evening, I had already sent my first encrypted message to a federal whistleblower attorney in Midtown Manhattan. I had already paid her $3,000 from my own savings to open a privileged channel. I had already filled 10 composition notebooks with cross-border wire observations, written in 4 languages, and I was on the 11th. $511 million in federal settlement, 24 months under seal, $148 million to me, personally, net of taxes and fees. I was the woman in the gray cashmere cardigan at table 28. I was the woman who finished her carrot cake while the room applauded her graceful sunsetting. I was the one who sent the message. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Edna Horvátová. I was born in Bratislava in 1965. My father died of pneumonia when I was 14. My mother worked 42 years at the Baťa shoe factory on the edge of the city, on the morning shift, then the evening shift, then the morning shift again. She never missed a day of work that I can remember, not even when her hands cracked from the degreasers they used in the tanning section. I came to the United States alone in the spring of 1985, 19 years old, through Vienna, through the sponsorship of my mother's cousin Nora in Paterson, New Jersey. I spoke Slovak, German, and Russian. I had learned English from cassette tapes starting at 17, and from 2 dictionary volumes my high school librarian had let me borrow indefinitely because she knew I would leave the country, and she did not want me to take her name off the borrower card. I kept those dictionaries for 37 years. They are still on the shelf in my kitchen in Hasbrook Heights. I worked the night shift at a ShopRite in Paterson for the first 2 years. My cousin Nora was a single mother raising 2 children and working the Lipton tea plant in East Rutherford, and we shared a brownstone duplex on Quincy Street with 1 working bathroom and a radiator that hissed all winter. I attended Bergen Community College during the day. I studied accounting and English. I was not brilliant. I was methodical. I finished my associate's degree in 1988 and transferred to Rutgers Newark for my bachelor's, which I earned in 1991, part-time, while continuing to work. The bank hired me as a wire clerk that summer, 37th floor of the tower in Midtown. I was 26 years old. The director of human resources asked me in the interview whether I could read business German. I said yes. He asked whether I could read Russian. I said yes. He asked whether I could keep confidential information confidential for a very long time. I said, yes, I can do that. I did not know then that this last question was the interview. For the first 4 years, I sat in a pool of 16 wire clerks, reading between 400 and 500 international wire messages a day, coding them for compliance, and flagging irregularities for the senior analysts. The work was tedious and specific. Most of my colleagues did not last 2 years. I liked the pattern. I liked reading a wire and recognizing, within 3 seconds, whether the instructions were standard, irregular, or fabricated. A wire is a small piece of writing. A bank wire is a sentence about a family, or a business, or a debt, or a gift, or a lie. In 1998, I was promoted to International Compliance Analyst. My son Daniel had been born in 1991. His father was a Slovak man named Josef Horvat, a carpenter, born in Queens, who I had married in 1992 and divorced in 1998. He was not a bad man. He simply needed a different life from the one I was willing to build. Daniel and I stayed in Hasbrook Heights. He is a tax attorney now, at a firm in Portland, Oregon. He is 34. He learned to be quiet the way his grandmother was quiet. In 2001, the bank asked me to sign a new employment agreement. The Human Resources Council at that time, a man named Harlan Gruber, was not paying close attention to the clauses I requested. I asked for one carve-out. I asked that any workbooks I maintained personally in the course of cross-border language maintenance remain my property and not be classified as bank work product. Harlan Gruber read it, shrugged, said it sounded reasonable, and signed. I filed a copy in a manila envelope in my kitchen and did not think about it again for 12 years. That carve-out is the reason this story has an ending. In 2008, the crisis year, the bank reorganized. A man named Bernhard Ostlund was brought over from the Stockholm office to lead a newly formed private wealth division. He was 38 years old, Swedish-American on his mother's side, with an Uppsala economics degree and a New York finance career. He spoke the kind of English that sounds rehearsed even when it is not. His suits were gray with a faint lilac undertone. He carried a moleskin with a thin silver pencil. He built a platform called Sovereign Wealth Platform. It was marketed to our high net worth clients as an integrated cross-border wealth preservation toolkit. The internal brochure used the phrase institutional elegance twice in one paragraph. I remember because I proofread it for a junior marketing analyst who needed a second pair of eyes. In 2012, I was promoted to International Compliance Officer, Level 7, which was the senior clerical grade below Vice President. My role expanded to ongoing transaction surveillance across 4 jurisdictions: the United States, Switzerland, Singapore, the Cayman Islands. I read, on average, 60% of the bank's cross-border wire traffic for U.S.-connected private clients. I had 1,300 flag patterns stored in my own head, not on any corporate server. In 2014, on my own time, on weekends, I built what I called the Aggregate Flow Monitor. It was not sophisticated. It was a read-only dashboard that queried the bank's transaction warehouse and produced a visualization of wire patterns by originating zip code, destination jurisdiction, and vehicle type. I built it in a personal sandbox that the IT architect, a soft-spoken man named Shaheen Rostami, reviewed and approved as non-intrusive. He wrote me a memo calling it a useful pattern tool for an analyst who knows what she is looking at. Shaheen left the bank in 2017 for a job at a regional credit union in Oregon. My credential was never revoked. Nobody thought to revoke it because nobody remembered I had it. For 3 years, the Aggregate Flow Monitor showed me nothing I had not already noticed in small increments. Then, in 2017, it began to show me a pattern. Certain zip codes in Manhattan, mostly Upper East Side and Soho, were originating an unusual volume of wire transfers through Liechtenstein foundations, known as Stiftungen. These foundations were set up by a small group of intermediary entities. The beneficial ownership documentation was minimal. One-page letters, scan only, signed by individuals whose names I did not recognize and who did not appear in any directory of international compliance professionals that I regularly read. I began to note these patterns in Composition Notebook number 9, which I had started in 2016. I wrote in English at first, then in German when I was tired, then in Slovak when I was angry, then in Russian when I wanted to think in a different grammar. The anger came slowly. It arrived the way certain Central European winters arrive. You notice the cold in your fingers before you notice the cold in the air. In the spring of 2019, on a Tuesday morning at 6:48, Bernhard Ostlund's administrative assistant, a young woman named Kyla, misrouted an email thread into my inbox. She had meant to send it to an analyst named Edna in the Milan office, whose email alias was one letter off from mine. The thread was between Bernhard and the regional director in Geneva. I was a CC on exactly one message, accidentally, for exactly 14 minutes. I read it. I saved it to a local encrypted folder. I then notified Kyla, politely, that the thread had come to me in error and she should check her directory. She apologized. I thanked her. The phrase in the thread, written by Bernhard, was this: "We maintain a tolerance envelope around gray area documentation. The platform functions precisely because we calibrate velocity against scrutiny thresholds." I read that sentence 4 times. I wrote it at the top of page 1 of Composition Notebook number 9. I underlined it in blue ink 3 times. Then I went to the break room and made a cup of black coffee, and I watched the steam rise from the surface, and I thought about my mother, who had stood for 42 years at a factory machine, and what it would have meant to her to know that someone like Bernhard Ostlund earned $4 million a year in order to calibrate velocity against scrutiny thresholds. In March of 2022, I prepared a 14-page internal memo and delivered it, with a polite cover letter, to Reed Lansing. Reed Lansing had come to the bank in 2020 after a 14-year career as an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York. He was a Wharton man, the kind of person who wore cufflinks that were actually cufflinks, not ornamental ones, and who spoke on panels at the International Private Banking Review annual conference about compliance as competitive advantage. He was 52. He had close-cropped silver hair and the posture of a person who has won things in public. He took my memo and read it in front of me in his corner office on the 42nd floor with the Hudson River visible through the window behind him. He read for 6 minutes. He did not take notes. He did not ask a single clarifying question. When he was finished, he looked up and he said the following sentence. I wrote it down 2 hours later in notebook number 10 in English because his exact words were important. Edna, you've built institutional memory we can all envy. This is important. But I want you to understand that our compliance posture is far more sophisticated than traditional enforcement would recognize. We don't just follow rules. We architect the future of the category. The gray area is where value is created for our clients. We manage that space. We do not fear it. I said thank you for his time. I left his office. I took the elevator down to my floor. I went into the ladies' room, which was on the 39th floor because our 38th floor bathroom had been under renovation since January, and I stood at the sink for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and I did not cry. I did not cry because I already understood that he was not ignorant. He was active. He was active and he was polished, and he was publicly respected, and he would not be corrected by anything that could be written on 14 pages. That was the moment I understood that the only path was external. External meant patience. External meant evidence. External meant that I would give this place what it deserved, which was not my complaint, but my silence. And then, at a time I chose, the contents of a document box that I had already begun to assemble. I opened composition notebook number 10 that evening in my kitchen in Hasbrook Heights. The notebook is the kind you buy at a drugstore for 99 cents. Marbled black and white cover. College ruled. 100 pages. I wrote on the first page a single sentence in Slovak. Teraz začíname. Now we begin. I want to tell you about the first client file I read after that evening because I think it will explain what the next 3 years looked like from the inside. The file belonged to a woman I will call Mrs. H because she is not a public figure. She is not a public official, and under the terms of the government settlement, her name is not mine to say. Mrs. H was 78 years old at the time I read her file, in April of 2022. She was the widow of a small appliance importer from Queens, New York, who had died in 2018 and left her the entirety of his modest estate. Her income, per her 2021 tax return, was $54,000 from Social Security and a municipal bond ladder. She paid her property taxes on time. She attended Sunday Mass at St. John the Baptist on Willoughby Avenue. She had one daughter, married, living in Ridgewood, New Jersey. She had never, in her entire life, traveled farther east than Long Island. The bank had, in 2019, moved $1,600,000 of her husband's life insurance proceeds into a Liechtenstein Stiftung, documented as a family wealth preservation vehicle, with beneficial ownership papers signed by a Liechtenstein attorney Mrs. H had never met, on a one-page letter, scan only. Her wealth advisor, a pleasant man in his early 30s with a Cornell MBA, had told her the vehicle was standard for estates of this character and had presented the paperwork to her in the wealth office on the 41st floor in a leather folder with the bank's logo embossed in gold. She had signed. She had trusted him. Her husband, for 40 years, had trusted the bank, and when her husband trusted something, she trusted it. I read her file for 35 minutes. I checked her FBAR filings. She had none. I checked her 1099 aggregate. Her offshore interest income, which under U.S. law she was required to report, had been reported nowhere. When, eventually, the Internal Revenue Service took up her case as one of 2,417 similar cases, Mrs. H would owe back taxes, penalties, and interest of approximately $411,000, which would require her to sell her Queens brownstone at age 81 to pay the IRS. Her wealth advisor's bonus for steering her into the Stiftung, which I traced through the compensation records I had been able to access, had been $11,400. I closed Mrs. H's file. I went to the break room. I stood at the window. The Hudson River that afternoon was the color of old aluminum. I thought about my mother's hands. I thought about the blue cotton scarf. I thought about the Liechtenstein attorney whose signature appeared on Mrs. H's beneficial ownership letter, a man whose office, I later confirmed through public records, sat 3 blocks from the main square in Vaduz. I thought about how many Mrs. H's there were, and I decided that I was going to read every one of them. The 3 years that followed were the quietest of my life. I mean this in the literal sense. I stopped attending the Friday after work gatherings at the bar across 6th Avenue. I stopped accepting invitations to colleagues' weddings unless I had known the person more than 10 years. I stopped answering work emails after 7 in the evening. I walked to my desk every morning at 6:40. I drank 1 cup of black coffee, no sugar, from the thermos I had brought from home. I read. I flagged. I saved. I went home at 6. I cooked a simple dinner. I opened the notebook I was working on. I wrote, in whichever language came to me, the observations of that day. I closed the notebook. I slept. In 22 months, between April of 2022 and February of 2024, I read in full, or in material part, the client files of 2,417 high net worth individuals connected to the United States through citizenship, long-term residency, or significant business holdings. I cross-referenced their wire transfer patterns against W-8BEN filings, against FBAR disclosures, or, more often, against the total absence of FBAR disclosures. I traced beneficial ownership chains across Liechtenstein Stiftungen, Singapore trusts, and Cayman-exempted companies. I noted, and this surprised me when I first saw the cluster, that 61% of the beneficial owner entities had been created from a single Internet Protocol address range in a specific conference room on the 4th floor of the bank's Zurich office between late 2015 and early 2019. That is the kind of detail that sounds like nothing when you first write it, and sounds like a federal indictment when you read it again 3 years later. By November of 2023, I had filled notebooks 10 through 13. Over 800 pages of handwritten cross-lingual observation. In English, when I was recording direct compliance language. In German, when I was quoting bank internal thresholds. In Slovak, for the heavier moral notations that I did not want to find in my own voice later. And in Russian for analytical reasoning, because Russian grammar forces you to specify whether the action was completed or continuous, and in compliance work, that distinction is everything. In October of 2022, I made the call that would decide the rest of my life. I contacted, through an obscure referral I had obtained from an old Rutgers Newark accounting professor, a senior partner at a law firm called Kensington & Rowe in Midtown. Her name was Marla Feinberg. She was 47. She had spent 8 years at the Treasury Office of Tax Affairs before moving to private practice in 2014. Her specialty was the IRS Whistleblower Program, which is the often overlooked sister of the False Claims Act. The IRS Whistleblower Program, under Section 7623 of the Internal Revenue Code, rewards individuals who report tax violations that are then recovered by the federal government. The award rate is between 15% and 30% of the collected amount, and the amounts involved are sometimes enormous. I sat down in Marla's office on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Her office was on the 33rd floor of a building on Park Avenue. Walnut desk, 2 coral-colored wingback chairs, a single east-facing window, a framed photograph of her 2 daughters on the credenza behind her. She was wearing pearl earrings and a navy blue cashmere sweater. She listened to me for 40 minutes. I had brought with me 3 composition notebooks and a typed summary, double-spaced, of approximately 30 pages. She asked 12 questions. She took handwritten notes. At the end of the meeting, she said quietly, "Ms. Horvátová, this is not a False Claims Act case. This is a tax case. We will use the IRS Whistleblower Program. The process will take between 24 and 30 months. You will not speak to me through any bank system, any bank email, any bank device. You will not discuss this with anyone, including your son, until I tell you it is safe. You will continue to do excellent work at the bank, and you will continue to fill your notebooks. Do you understand? I said yes. She said, one more thing. The retainer for this type of engagement is typically $50,000. I am going to ask you to pay $3,000 today in order to establish a formal attorney-client relationship. The balance will be carried through the contingency arrangement. Do you have $3,000 available? I said yes. I wrote her a personal check from my Hasbrook Heights savings and loan account. That check, which I still have a photocopy of, was the first time in 24 years I had spent my own money on my own defense. Over the next 18 months, I communicated with Marla through an encrypted Wicker channel. My messages to her were short, mostly 1 to 3 sentences, factual, zero speculation, zero rage. Her messages to me were even shorter. She would send, for example, confirm Zurich IP cluster, confirm date range, confirm volume. I would reply, for example, confirmed 61%, November 2015 to March 2019, 1,474 entities. In February of 2024, through an industry women in finance breakfast downtown, I arranged a casual meeting with a woman named Gabrielle Lenoir Prochaska. Gabrielle was 47 at the time. She had been vice president of international wire operations at our bank for 11 years. She had resigned in mid-2023, citing on her LinkedIn page an irreconcilable philosophical disagreement with platform direction. She lived in a townhouse in Brooklyn Heights. She was divorced. Her 2 children were at a boarding school in New Hampshire, paid for by her ex-husband's family money. She had gone to Middlebury, then Harvard for business school. She was the kind of American professional woman who had never, in 47 years, lacked for confidence in a room. She wore a black turtleneck and a strand of pearls that might have been her grandmother's. I did not ask Gabrielle to testify. I did not ask her to confirm anything. I only asked her to save, for her own professional protection, any internal correspondence she had kept that involved sovereign platform tolerance framing. She looked at me across a small marble table in a cafe on Smith Street in Brooklyn, and she said, Edna, you're the only one of them who sees what's in front of her eyes. Whatever it is you're building, when you need me, I will be there. I said thank you. I did not cry in front of her. I cried on the F train on the way home. It was the first time I had cried in 11 years. My son Daniel, during those years, would call every Sunday at 7:30 in the evening, Eastern. He was thorough. He was a tax attorney. He had been trained at Lewis and Clark Law School to read silences. On a particular Sunday in April of 2024, 3 weeks before the Form 211 would be filed, he called me from a parking lot in Portland after a late Saturday night at his firm. He told me about a partner meeting that week. He told me about his girlfriend, an epidemiologist named Saskia. He told me that his lawn needed work. Then, carefully, in the kind of voice he had used on me when he was 7 years old, asking whether Santa was real, he said, Mom, is something going on at the bank? I said, Nothing that you need to worry about, Daniel. He was quiet for 9 seconds. I counted. Then he said, Okay, I love you. I said, I love you too. Tell Saskia hello from me. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes. I did not cry. I opened Notebook 13. I wrote, in Slovak, 2 sentences about how a mother protects a son by not explaining, and how a son protects a mother by not asking, and how the distance between Portland and Hasbrook Heights on a Sunday evening in April is the exact distance at which both people are allowed to hold their silence honorably. In March of 2024, the month before the final binder, I met Gabrielle Lenoir Prochaska a second time. She suggested it. She called me from a prepaid phone she had purchased specifically for this purpose at a bodega in Carroll Gardens. She asked me to meet her on a Wednesday afternoon at a French cafe on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights called La Petite Terrasse. I arrived at 2. She was already there, in a booth at the back, in a gray turtleneck and the same pearl strand from February. She had brought with her a cardboard file box, not large, perhaps the size of a ream of paper. Inside the box were printed copies of 16 email threads she had saved during her final 18 months at the bank. Bernhard Ostland was the author on 11 of them. Reed Lansing was copied on 7. The word tolerance appeared 14 times across the threads. The phrase calibrate velocity appeared 4 times. The phrase documentation latitude appeared 6 times. Gabrielle slid the box across the table to me. She said, "Edna, I did not give you this. I have never given you this. If you need me to sign an affidavit about what is in here, I will sign it. If you need me to testify, I will testify. My grandfather worked on the Boston waterfront in 1956. He would not have approved of any of those men." I took the box. I carried it home on the F train in a canvas tote bag from the Strand bookstore. I did not open it on the train. I opened it that evening at my blue-tiled counter. I photographed every page. I sent the photographs encrypted to Marla. I returned the printed copies to the brown document box. The box in my basement that evening held 13 composition notebooks, the Gabrielle documents, a photocopy of the 2019 Bernhard Misrouted email, a photocopy of my 2001 employment agreement carve-out, and my personal check for $3,000 to Kensington and Row from October 2022. It was, by any measure, a federal prosecutor would have recognized, a complete case file in a cardboard box above a furnace in New Jersey. In 2023, my annual performance review rated me exemplary. I received a 4% raise, from $191,000 to $198,000. The bank gave me a gift card to the BG restaurant in the Bergdorf Goodman building downstairs, in the amount of $500. I used $47 of it, on a salad and a club soda, during a single lunch with Daniel in May of that year when he was visiting from Portland. The rest expired. In December of 2023, the bank announced an internal reorganization. My role was reoriented to what was called Senior Advisory Review. In practice, this meant fewer direct transaction reviews. My aggregate flow monitor access remained intact because nobody in the new reporting line knew I had it. My notebooks were already at home. My office, the small corner one with 1 window and 3 pale archive boxes on the floor under the radiator, remained mine. I was not concerned. In the first quarter of 2024, the Wealth Division won an industry award, Best Cross-Border Wealth Management 2024, from the International Private Banking Review. The photograph, which appeared on the front page of the Monday Wall Street Journal Finance section, showed Bernhard Ostland holding a small golden statuette. Reed Lansing stood in the second row, smiling. My elbow was on my blue-tiled kitchen counter that Sunday morning when I saw the paper. I folded it in thirds. I put it in the recycling bin. I poured myself a second cup of coffee. "The awards are how you know they are confident," I wrote in notebook number 13 that evening. "The confidence is how you know they do not expect me." In April of 2024, Marla signaled readiness. I spent 4 weekends in a row in my Hasbrook Heights kitchen and in my basement, compiling the final evidentiary binder. 287 pages, 4 languages, cross-referenced to Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation case matrix conventions that Marla had provided. I delivered the binder to Marla's office on the afternoon of Tuesday, May 7th, 2024. She took it from me without comment. She shook my hand. She said, "Ms. Horvátová, go home, sleep. I will file it on Sunday." On Sunday, May 12th, 2024, at 9 in the morning, Marla Feinberg filed Internal Revenue Service Form 211 with the 287-page binder attached, with the Internal Revenue Service Whistleblower Office in Ogden, Utah. A triple copy was sealed to the Southern District of New York docket, flagged for Treasury Office of Tax Affairs review. I did not know she had filed until that following Tuesday. On Tuesday evening, my phone pinged at 7:11. A single word from Marla through Wicker. "Filed!" I looked at my son's picture on my refrigerator. Daniel at 7, on a small bicycle, in front of our Hasbrook Heights house, 1998, the year I divorced his father. I said to the picture, quietly, in Slovak, "Teraz pôjde čas." Now, time will pass. 5 months passed. I continued to do my work. Nothing in my professional life changed on the surface. I continued to sit in my corner office, to read the journals to which I was entitled, to eat my lunch in the break room. Every 2 weeks, I received a short encrypted message from Marla confirming that the matter was progressing, that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had formally joined in late July, that Treasury OTA had opened its parallel review in August. Then came the Knickerbocker dinner. On Friday, October 11th, 2024, at approximately 6:40 in the evening, I arrived at the Knickerbocker Country Club in Tenafly, New Jersey. I drove my own 2011 Toyota Camry, gray pearl exterior, 187,000 miles on it. My right headlight had been slowly failing for 6 weeks. I had been meaning to replace it. I was wearing a gray cashmere cardigan over a plain black wool sheath dress, silver earrings my mother had given me at the Vienna airport in 1985. I carried a slim black leather clutch containing my wallet, one Lenox pen, my reading glasses, and a folded memory of my mother's airport goodbye that is not a physical object but takes up space regardless. The Private Wealth Annual Client Dinner was the bank's second most important corporate evening of the year. 240 guests, black tie optional, executives, clients, client spouses, Wealth Division branding banners with gold leaf in the main entry hall, a string quartet in the cocktail room playing Debussy at an inoffensive volume. At the cocktail hour, I circulated minimally. 2 junior advisors introduced themselves, a man named Brent Kowalski and a woman named Serena Madrigal Peña, both of whom had joined the bank within the last 3 years, and neither of whom had ever heard my name. They asked, politely, how I was enjoying the evening. I said the cardigan was keeping me warm in the cool of the air conditioning. They laughed. We did not speak further. At 8, I was seated at table 28. Historically, table 28 had been my assigned table for 7 consecutive years. That evening, I shared it with Brent, Serena, Jared Ofery, another junior from the Florida office, and 3 clients' wives whose husbands were deep in conversation at other tables. The duck confit arrived at 8:23. The carrot cake, the bank's signature dessert, which the chef had been making for 14 years and which was in fact very good, arrived at 9:15. At 9:30, 2 Reed Lansing took the microphone in the main ballroom. He was wearing a tuxedo with a blush silk pocket square. He spoke for 6 minutes. He opened with gratitude to the clients. He thanked 3 executive colleagues. He made a short reference to the upcoming corporate retreat in Aspen. And then, near the end of his remarks, with the kind of measured warmth that public speaking coaches charge $3,000 a session to teach, he said the following. I want to recognize tonight the extraordinary dedication of a colleague whose role is evolving in a way that speaks to everything we believe about institutional memory. Edna Horvátová, whose 24 years of cross-border attentiveness have become foundational to how we think about the long arc of compliance excellence, is gracefully sunsetting into an elevated advisory council position, where her depth will continue to shape our trajectory. Edna, please stand. I did not stand. I did not raise my glass. I did not signal. I remained seated. I finished the bite of carrot cake that had been on my fork. I looked up, eventually, toward the microphone, and I nodded once, in Reed Lansing's direction, with the particular Central European nod that is not agreement and not disagreement, but only acknowledgement. The applause was polite. It lasted 8 seconds. Brent Kowalski, next to me, leaned over and said, Edna, that's wonderful! Congratulations! I said, Thank you, Brent. At 9:48, I excused myself. I collected my coat from the coat check. I asked the valet for my car. The rain had begun during dinner. The valet stand was under a green awning. The valet was a young man, Dominican, I think, polite, no more than 22 years old, and he brought the Camry around in under 2 minutes. He held the driver's door for me. I tipped him $15 for my clutch. At 10:02, I was in my car, in the parking lot, under a sodium light, with rain on the windshield and the right headlight half dead. I turned the ignition. I did not drive. I opened Wicker. I typed 1 sentence. The timing has arrived. I sent it. At 10:04, Marla's reply came back. Understood. Sleep. I will handle the next 48 hours. I sat for another 3 minutes in the parking lot. I turned on the radio. I found a classical stream that was playing Smetana's Vltava. The Vltava is a Czech river. My grandmother Marta was born in a village in western Slovakia, 40 kilometers from where the Vltava becomes the Morava. I listened to the entire piece, 14 minutes. Then I drove home to Hasbrook Heights, 37 minutes, and I put the kettle on and I opened notebook number 14, the last one, which I had started that July, and I wrote 2 sentences in Slovak. I closed the notebook. I placed it in the brown document box with the other 13, which lived on the shelf above the furnace in my basement. I went to bed. I slept 6 hours. On Monday morning, October 14th, I reported to work. At 10, I had a meeting with Human Resources in the formal conference room on the 36th floor. The HR director, a woman named Philippa Ainsworth, explained that my transition to the advisory council would be effective November 1st. My title would be Senior Advisor, Compliance Legacy Review. I would have no direct reports. My system access would be adjusted to read only legacy archives. I would be physically relocated to an advisory suite on the 38th floor, which, she said, was being freshly refurbished and would offer a quieter, reflective environment. I asked one question. Will I retain my aggregate flow monitor credentials? Philippa checked her notes. She said, I don't see that on your access list, so I assume no. Is that a system you use regularly? I said, no, I was only asking for record keeping. That was the one lie I told the bank during the entire 24-year arc. That afternoon, I ran my final aggregate flow monitor query. It was a confirmatory sweep. I verified the Zurich IP cluster one final time. I exported nothing. I logged out. I walked to the elevator. I took it down to the lobby. I walked out onto 6th Avenue and I bought a pretzel from the cart on the corner. It was $2.50. The vendor asked if I wanted mustard. I said yes. I ate the pretzel while walking the 3 blocks to the subway. I got on the PATH train home. On Tuesday, October 29th, I completed my final transaction review. A routine outbound wire from a Manhattan client to a Singapore trust. I flagged it. I sent my note to the reviewing analyst. I closed my browser. I packed up the one photograph I kept on my desk, which was Daniel at age 12 in a soccer uniform. I placed it in my tote bag. I locked my office door. I left my keycard on my desk, as instructed by Philippa. I took the elevator down for the last time from the 42nd floor. I did not say goodbye to anyone. There was no one to say goodbye to. From November 1st through January 15th, I was, technically, in the advisory council. In practice, I came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, from 10 to 3, sat in the 38th floor suite, which had been quickly refurbished to an industrial beige, and contained exactly 1 empty oak desk and 1 empty leather chair, and I read industry journals. I collected my paycheck. In December, I accepted the retirement enhancement package Philippa offered. 48 months of severance, full pension, 36 months of paid COBRA coverage, a standard non-disclosure agreement, which Marla had already reviewed and which, because federal whistleblower protections supersede private NDAs, did not compromise my case. My last day was January 15th, 2025. There was no party. I walked out of the building at 4:17 in the afternoon. It was snowing. I took the PATH home. I made a cup of tea. I sat in my kitchen, at the blue-tiled counter, for an hour, not doing anything. I thought about my mother. I thought about Shaheen Rostami, who had written the memo approving my aggregate flow monitor in 2014, and who now lived in Oregon and almost certainly had no idea what he had unlocked. I thought about Harlan Gruber, the HR counsel who had signed my carve-out in 2001. I thought about Nora Horvátová, my cousin, who had died in 2011 of ovarian cancer in a small Catholic hospital in Passaic. I thought about the 2,417 client files I had read. I did not think about Reed Lansing or Bernhard Ostland at all. The 24 months that followed my filing were the longest and the shortest of my life. In April of 2024, I had still been assembling the binder. In October, I had been humiliated at a country club. In November, I had been moved to a freshly beige suite. In January of 2025, I had left the building. In February of 2025, the IRS whistleblower office formally acknowledged the filing. In April, Treasury Office of Tax Affairs opened its parallel review. In May, the Department of Justice Tax Division formally joined the matter. In June, the first FATCA data exchange request went to the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority. In August, the Liechtenstein request. In September, the Singapore request. In November, the Cayman request. By January of 2026, all 4 jurisdictions had returned substantial data packages. During these months, I did the following. I walked to the Hasbrook Heights Free Public Library on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I borrowed, in sequence, every book by Bohumil Hrabal, then by Milan Kundera, then by Pavel Velikovsky that the library system had. I cooked for myself. I spoke with Daniel on Sunday evenings for 30 to 40 minutes by telephone. He called me every Sunday at 7:30 Eastern, without fail. I did not tell him. He sensed something. He did not ask. I began that spring a personal project that I had been considering for many years. My grandmother Marta had kept a diary during the Second World War, covering the years 1940 through 1945, which had passed through my mother's hands to mine in 1999. It was written in Slovak, in a small hand, on roughly 120 pages of thin paper. I began the translation of the diary into English. I worked on it 3 evenings a week. I was patient. Twice a month, I had a short telephone call with Marla. The calls were privileged. They were brief, 4 to 6 minutes, mostly to confirm that no procedural deadlines required my attention, that no leak had occurred, that the grand jury was not yet impaneled. In October of 2025, the Southern District of New York impaneled the grand jury. Marla told me at the end of our call that week, "Edna, stay quiet. You may want to avoid travel for the next 5 months." I stayed quiet. I did not travel. I walked to the library. I translated my grandmother's diary. I cooked kapustnica for New Year's Eve, alone, and I watched the Vienna Philharmonic on the television. I want to tell you about Christmas Eve of 2025 because it was the moment during the 24 months of silence when I came the closest to telling someone the truth. I had cooked that evening a traditional Slovak Christmas Eve dinner, which my mother had cooked for me every year of my childhood, and which I had cooked for Daniel every year of his. Wafer with honey and garlic, mushroom soup, fried carp from the Ridgewood Fish Market, which is not the river carp my grandmother would have eaten in Lozorno, but which is the closest I can do in Bergen County. Boiled potatoes, sauerkraut, poppy seed rolls. I had set the table for one. I had lit a single beeswax candle. Daniel called from Portland at 6:40. Saskia was with him. They were going skiing on Mount Hood in the morning. They wished me a Merry Christmas. Daniel asked, again, carefully, how I was doing. I said I was well. I said the carp had turned out better than last year. Daniel said, "Mom, whatever it is you are not telling me, I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. I am just here. When you are ready, I am here." I said, "Thank you, Daniel, I know." I hung up. I sat at the table. I ate the carp. I drank one small glass of Slivovitz from a bottle I had been keeping for 20 years. I thought, seriously, and for perhaps 11 minutes, about calling Daniel back and telling him everything. The binder, the carve-out, the aggregate flow monitor, the Knickerbocker, the filing, all of it. I did not call him back. I understood that the reason I did not call was not fear. The reason was that the story did not belong to him yet. It belonged to the federal system that was, at that moment on Christmas Eve, with most federal employees at home with their own families, quietly, slowly, doing its work on 17 hard drives in 3 different federal buildings between Washington and Utah. When the federal system was done, the story would belong to the bank, and then to the press, and then, eventually, at a time of my choosing, to Daniel. Until then, the only person the story belonged to was me, and telling a story that belongs only to you to another person on Christmas Eve for comfort is a kind of theft from the story itself. I washed the dishes. I put out the candle. I went upstairs. I opened my grandmother's diary. I translated 3 pages. In one of them, dated March of 1943, she wrote, "The waiting is longer than the trouble, but the waiting is also what makes you certain, later, that you were correct to wait." I went to bed. I slept 7 hours. On February 18th, 2026, the grand jury returned a sealed indictment. The bank's counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell began the deferred prosecution agreement negotiations the following Monday. On March 11th, 2026, the Department of Justice Tax Division, the Internal Revenue Service, and the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York announced, in a joint press conference at 10 in the morning, that the bank would pay a federal settlement of $511 million. The largest IRS whistleblower-derived tax compliance settlement since UBS in 2009. A 5-year deferred prosecution agreement with a court-appointed corporate monitor. The sovereign wealth platform dissolved. Bernhard Ostland announced his retirement that afternoon. Reed Lansing announced his departure to pursue independent consulting at the end of the week. Separately, 2,417 identified high-net-worth clients were offered the Offshore Voluntary Disclosure Program pathway. Aggregate client-level penalties were expected to reach approximately $1.1 billion over the following 24 months. On April 3, 2026, the IRS Whistleblower Office finalized my award, 29% of the federal recovery, $148.2 million gross. After federal tax, New Jersey state tax, the 28% contingency fee to Kensington and Rowe, and the allocation for legal costs, my net was approximately $89 million. I did not speak to the press. The Department of Justice press release did not name me. Form 211 anonymity provisions applied because I had elected them at filing. The financial media, for a week or two, speculated about the whistleblower in several articles. The Wall Street Journal, which had put Bernhard Ostland on its front page in January of 2024, now put the bank settlement on its front page in March of 2026. Bernhard's photograph did not appear. On April 10, 2026, the New York Attorney Grievance Committee received a referral from the Department of Justice Civil Division. A formal complaint was filed against Reed Lansing's bar membership for conduct in post-government practice inconsistent with the canons of professional responsibility. His hearing was scheduled for September of 2026. The Southern District of New York United States Attorney, Reed Lansing's former office, opened a separate investigation into his individual post-government conduct. Reed Lansing relocated in April to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He began, per information my son Daniel received through a mutual acquaintance on social media, to sell antique fly fishing reels on eBay. He had become, in the phrase of one industry trade journal, unreachable for comment. Daniel forwarded me the acquaintance's post. I looked at it once. I did not respond. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt a small tiredness, similar to the tiredness I had felt sometimes in the break room at the bank on Friday afternoons at 4:30. Bernhard Ostland retired officially in May. He relocated to a property his family owned outside Stockholm. The sovereign wealth platform was dissolved and rebuilt under federal monitor. Several mid-level managers were reassigned. The bank's International Compliance Division was formally restructured under a new leader, a woman named Dr. Anneke Vandermeer, who had spent 20 years at De Nederlandsche Bank and who was known, in international compliance circles, as someone who did not smile at dinner parties. I read one interview with her in a European finance journal. I thought, she will be adequate. She will not be perfect. The bank will not be what it was, but it will not be what it almost became either. I kept my Hasbrook Heights house. Daniel suggested, in early April, that I consider a penthouse in Manhattan. He had looked at some listings in the West Village. I thanked him. I declined. I said that the house my mother had never seen, but that I had paid off in 2014, was where I had lived for 37 years and where I intended to live for another 20 if my health permitted. He did not argue. He understood. I used $3 million of the award to establish the Anežka Horvátová Charitable Educational Trust through the Slovak Embassy Education Fund in Washington, D.C. The trust provides annual scholarships to the daughters of factory worker families in Slovakia who are studying accounting, tax, or forensic finance at Slovak or American universities. The trust chair is Dr. Zuzana Kolárik, a retired economist from the Slovak Academy of Sciences, whom I had met exactly once in Bratislava in 2018 at my mother's funeral. She had been my mother's neighbor for 12 years. She had agreed to chair the trust by return telephone call without asking me a single question about it. In late April, I flew KLM from John F. Kennedy to Amsterdam, then to Vienna. I rented a small white Skoda at the Vienna airport and drove the hour and 15 minutes to Bratislava. I stayed in a modest hotel near the Old Town. I did not contact anyone. On April 29th, I visited my mother's grave at the Ondřejský cintorín, the city cemetery where she had been buried on a cold December afternoon in 2018. The cemetery is flat and Austro-Hungarian in its character, gravel paths, rows of black granite. I brought no flowers. My mother had always disliked cut flowers from supermarkets. I sat on the small iron bench across from her grave for an hour. It was windy. I did not speak. I had one more thing to do in Bratislava, and that was the paperwork. Slovak law, under Section 19 of the Burial Act of 2010, permits the relocation of remains between cemeteries at the request of a first-degree relative with municipal approval. I visited the cemetery administrative office the next morning. I filled out the forms. I paid the fee, which was €37. The relocation was scheduled for May 4th. On May 4th, I drove 40 kilometers northwest to the village of Lozorno, which sits in the foothills of the Male Carpati, population approximately 3,200, mostly elderly, and which is the village where my mother was born in 1938 and where my grandmother Marta was buried in 1961. The village church, St. Catherine's, has a simple wooden beam ceiling and a cemetery on a slope behind the rectory, looking across a valley to the next village. The valley had been, when my grandmother was a child, a place where the women of Lozorno grew cabbage and carrots and raised geese. It was, in 2026, mostly vineyard. The stone arrived by municipal truck at 11 in the morning. 2 men helped set it, next to my grandmother Marta's stone, which had stood there for 65 years. My mother's name, Anežka Horvátová, Road, Mykrok, 1938 to 2018. The village priest, Father Daniel Christine, was a young man of perhaps 38, thin, black-cassocked, who had been informed of the relocation by the municipal office. He watched from the church entrance. He did not approach. I thought that was the correct kindness. When the stone was in place, I cut a few branches of Gelder rose, Kalina, from a bush at the edge of the cemetery path, and I placed them between my mother's stone and my grandmother's stone. It was a gray afternoon, a very light rain. The rain in that part of Slovakia in early May has a particular softness. I stood there for 40 minutes. I did not speak aloud. I said one sentence in my own head, in Slovak. Moja matka pracovala 42 rokov v továrni. Ja som pracovala 24 rokov v banke. Rozdiel medzi nami je menší, než som si myslela v 35, a väčší, než chápem v 59. My mother worked 42 years at the factory. I worked 24 years at the bank. The difference between us is less than I thought at 35, and larger than I understand at 59. I drove back to Bratislava. I returned the Skoda. I flew home on May 10th. The first thing I did when I returned to Hasbrook Heights was make a cup of black tea. I drank it standing at the blue-tiled counter, with the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window in the particular angle that my kitchen gets only in early May. I went downstairs to the basement. I took notebook number 14 off the shelf above the furnace. I brought it upstairs. I opened it to the final blank page. I wrote one sentence, in English, in my careful cursive. The ledger is complete. I closed the notebook. I placed it back in the brown document box with the other 13. I returned the box to the shelf above the furnace. I want to tell you what I have learned. I am 59 years old. I have been in this country for 41 years. I have 24 years in a bank, 13 years as an analyst, 11 years as an officer, and a son who writes tax law briefs in a city I have visited only once. I have a mother buried next to her mother in a sloped cemetery in a village at the edge of the Male Carpati. I have $89 million in a federal whistleblower award and $3 million in a charitable trust for the daughters of factory workers in my country. I have 14 composition notebooks on a shelf above my furnace. I have learned that patience is not passivity. I have learned that silence is not agreement. I have learned that the most dangerous person in a corporate hierarchy is the one who is never flashy, never promoted into public view, never invited to the corporate retreats in Aspen, but who has been reading everything that passes through her desk for 24 years and who has been writing it down in 4 languages in 99-cent composition notebooks that nobody else in the building can physically read. I have learned that the people who build these schemes believe that the surveillance is the threat. They are wrong. The translation is the threat. Anybody can see the numbers. Only a small number of people can read them in all of the languages they were written to hide. I have learned that the people who enforce the schemes, who architect them, who calibrate them, who put on tuxedos and take microphones at country club dinners, believe that their polish protects them. They are wrong about that too. The polish is what makes them visible. A clumsier antagonist would have been harder to catch. Reed Lansing was very catchable because he had spent 14 years as a federal prosecutor learning exactly how an elegant fraud would look. He built one. He forgot the direction the wind was blowing. I have learned that my mother was the model for everything I have done. Not because she was a whistleblower. She was a shoe factory worker. She wore a blue cotton scarf to the factory every morning for 42 years. She never read the business section of any newspaper. But she had a rule, which she said to me only once, when I was 17, the evening before I left for Vienna. She said, in Slovak, that there is one thing you always notice about a place you work. You notice whether the people who run it love the work, or whether they love themselves. If they love the work, she said, you stay, even when the pay is bad. If they love themselves, she said, you leave, even when the pay is good. And if you are still there 10 years later, and you have noticed, and you have stayed, she said, you will owe the place a kind of honesty it does not deserve. You will owe it, she said, the truth. I owed it the truth. I gave it the truth. I gave it the truth in 4 languages and in 14 notebooks, and the truth arrived as a federal settlement on a gray Tuesday morning in March. If you are watching this, and you are an older American, and you have worked the same job for 20 years, and you have noticed, in the last 5 or 6 years, that the people who are now running the place have begun to treat the work as an optimization problem rather than a trust, and you have wondered whether you are too tired or too old or too marginal to do anything about it, I want you to know something. The tiredness is the evidence. The fact that you have noticed is the evidence. The fact that you are still here is the evidence. Write it down, save the documents, find an attorney in the proper program, pay the $3,000 from your own savings, then continue to do your work and continue to be noticed only for the work and wait. The difference between you and them is that they think time is on their side. Time is on the side of the person who is writing it down. I am writing this in my kitchen in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, on a rainy Thursday evening in late May of 2026. Tomorrow, I will walk to the library. Next week, I will finish the translation of my grandmother's diary. Next month, I will visit Daniel in Portland for his 34th birthday. In the fall, I will testify, under seal, if requested, at the grand jury proceedings that may still develop against Reed Lansing personally. I will wear a gray cashmere cardigan. I will carry a slim black leather clutch. I will answer the questions I am asked, and I will not answer questions I am not asked. There is a particular Slovak verb for the patience that endures past the point where patience looks like defeat. The verb is vytrvat. It means to outlast. Not to win, to outlast. My mother outlasted her factory. I outlasted my bank. This is what I have learned. The ledger is complete.